recently deleted history. There are photographs that do more than capture a moment, they accuse an entire nation. One of them still has that power. I'm going to show you a picture that may make some people uncomfortable. And that discomfort is exactly why it matters. It is known as scourged back, perhaps the most iconic image ever taken of slavery in the United States. At first glance, it is simple, a man seated with his back exposed. But within seconds, the eye stops seeing skin and starts seeing evidence. Thick ridges of scar tissue cross his shoulders and spine like twisted ropes. The flesh appears carved, not healed. This was not one beating. This was repetition, policy, routine, industry. The photograph was taken in 1863 and depicts a formerly enslaved man from Louisiana, widely identified as Gordon, sometimes called Peter. His back had been raised into layers of scar tissue owing to repeated whippings. In one frame, the abstract arguments of politicians collapsed. No speech could soften it. No euphemism could hide it. No plantation myth could survive it. For many Americans in the North, slavery had long existed as distance. They knew it through newspapers, speeches, debates in Congress, and angry editorials. It was discussed in legal language, economic language, constitutional language, but distance can anesthetize the mind. A person may condemn cruelty in theory, while never truly confronting what cruelty looks like. Then this image arrived. Suddenly, slavery was no longer a question of tariffs, states' rights, or regional custom. It was a human back split open by a system that called itself lawful. The timing mattered. America was already deep in civil war. Hundreds of thousands were dead, or soon would be. Families mourned sons. Cities filled hospitals. Many still asked whether the war was worth its cost. Then came this photograph, showing exactly what kind of nation the conflict was about to become. It forced a brutal question. If this is what peace had tolerated, what was war trying to end? Abolitionists understood the power immediately. They circulated the image in newspapers, pamphlets, lecture halls, and churches. They knew statistics could be ignored. Testimony could be doubted. But scars were difficult to debate. The body itself had become a witness. In parlors and meeting rooms across the North, people stared at the photograph and saw what enslaved people had been saying for generations. Some looked away. Others could not. Yet the image did more than expose Southern brutality. It exposed Northern comfort, because many who opposed slavery had still managed to keep it emotionally distant, safely contained in another region, another economy, another moral failure. This photograph crossed that border. It entered homes. It sat on tables. It traveled through print shops. It made spectators participants in memory. And once seen, it could not be unseen. That is why the picture endured in textbooks, museums, documentaries, and classrooms for generations. It became part of how America explains slavery to itself, not as a vague institution, but as violence administered to real bodies. Yet even the most famous evidence can become inconvenient when a nation grows tired of self-examination. More than 160 years later, in September 2025, reports emerged that national park employees said this same photograph had been flagged for removal, along with exhibits involving slavery. The old scars had entered a new battle. What frightened people in 1863 was the cruelty it revealed. What frightens some people now may be the memory it preserves. Because images can do something dangerous. They make the past personal. They refuse to let horror remain abstract. They turn numbers into nerves, policies into pain, and history into accountability. And that is why one man's scarred back still unsettles the United States today. Before he became a symbol, however, he was a hunted man trying to survive. To understand the photograph, we have to understand the person who carried those scars into freedom. Before he was a symbol in American memory, he was a man inside a machine designed to break men. The figure in the photograph is widely identified as Gordon, though some records use the name Peter. Like countless enslaved people in the 19th century South, even his name comes to us through fragments, inconsistencies, and the paperwork of others. that uncertainty is its own kind of testimony. Slavery often stole more than labor. It stole birthdays, surnames, marriages, literacy, family records, and the right to leave behind a clear trail of one's own life. What survives instead are scars, military notes, newspaper mentions, and a single unforgettable image. Gordon lived in Louisiana, one of the richest slave-holding regions in the United States, rich not because of justice or innovation, but because sugar and cotton extracted enormous wealth through coerced black labor. Louisiana plantations were infamous for brutality. Sugar cultivation in particular demanded punishing physical labor in sweltering heat, dangerous machinery, and relentless harvest schedules. Enslaved workers were often considered disposable. If a body broke, another could be purchased. That was the arithmetic of the system. According to accounts circulated during the Civil War, Gordon fled a plantation after enduring severe whipping by an overseer. The scars on his back were described as the result of repeated lashings. To modern eyes, the damage appears almost impossible, but to those who lived under slavery, it was tragically recognizable. Whipping served several purposes at once: punishment, intimidation, spectacle, and control. It disciplined not only the person struck, but everyone forced to hear it. Gordon's escape was not a simple act of walking away. Leaving bondage in the Deep South meant entering a landscape built to trap you. Plantations were connected by roads, patrols, sheriffs, informants, swamps, rivers, dogs, and armed men who could legally hunt human beings. Rewards were offered for capture. Newspapers regularly ran notices describing escaped people the way one might describe livestock: height, complexion, scars, clothing, skills. Every detail turned identity into inventory. Yet people still ran. They ran at night. They ran hungry. They ran with children, alone or in pairs. They ran knowing that capture could mean mutilation, sale, or death. Accounts say Gordon moved through swampland 4 days, using onions or other means to confuse tracking dogs. Crossing water where scent could be lost. Whether every detail was perfectly recorded matters less than the larger truth. Escape demanded ingenuity, endurance, and nerve beyond what most free people ever have to summon. The same society that later called enslaved people inferior had built an entire security apparatus to keep them from leaving. Eventually Gordon reached Union lines near Baton Rouge, where federal forces had gained footholds in Louisiana. Imagine that moment. After years in a world where white uniforms, horses, and armed men usually meant danger, he encountered soldiers who represented a different possibility. Not equality, not yet, but a breach in the wall. The Civil War had transformed geography. Where Union armies advanced, slavery's certainty weakened. Camps filled with refugees, formerly enslaved families, laborers, scouts, cooks, teamsters, and men eager to fight for the very country that had enslaved them. It was there, in that charged wartime environment, that photographers captured Gordon's back. One account says soldiers were stunned when he removed his shirt. Another says the image was intentionally made to document abuse. Both can be true. The men around him had likely seen battlefield wounds, amputations, and death. Yet these scars were different. They were not caused by cannon fire in war. They were caused by policy in peacetime. The resulting photograph did something rare. It restored individuality to a person whom slavery had tried to reduce to property. We still do not know every chapter of Gordon's life, but we know he resisted. We know he survived long enough to reach freedom's edge. We know he stood before the camera, not hidden, not bowed, but present. In some versions of his story, he later joined the Union Army, turning from fugitive into soldier. If true, it carries a fierce historical symmetry. A man whipped under American law taking up arms in American uniform. Yet Gordon's story was not exceptional because it was unique. It was exceptional because it was documented. Thousands suffered similar violence with no camera nearby, no surviving name, no preserved testimony. For every famous scar, there were countless unseen wounds. And that is the deeper meaning of the image. It is one man, yes, but also many. To understand why his photograph shook the nation, we must understand the larger world that produced it, a system so normalized that millions lived beside it without fully seeing it. To understand why Gordon's photograph shocked so many Americans, we need to understand something even more unsettling. Millions already knew slavery existed, yet many had learned not to truly see it. By 1860, slavery was not a fading relic in the United States. It was one of the most profitable labor systems in the world. Nearly 4 million enslaved people lived in bondage, concentrated in the South, but tied economically to banks, insurers, textile mills, shipping firms, and merchants far beyond it. Cotton grown by enslaved hands fed factories in New England and Britain. Sugar enriched traders and planters. Human bodies were collateral for loans. Children could be listed as future assets. In this sense, slavery was not separate from American capitalism, it was woven into it. On plantations, daily life was governed by force disguised as order. Dawn to dark labor was common. Field hands planted, chopped, hauled, harvested, and endured heat that exhausted even the overseers who watched them. Domestic workers cooked, cleaned, nursed white children while being separated from their own. Skilled enslaved laborers built structures, repaired machinery, forged metal, drove wagons, and performed work that required intelligence and expertise, while being denied the rights that should accompany both. Productivity was extracted through surveillance and punishment. The whip was not an exception to the system. It was one of its management tools. Families existed under permanent threat. Husbands and wives could be owned by different people. Children could be sold south to settle debts. Mothers woke not knowing whether their child would still be nearby by nightfall. Auctions turned grief into spectacle. Buyers inspected teeth, muscles, posture, age, fertility, obedience. Human beings were made to stand still while strangers calculated their price. Those scenes happened in city markets and courthouse squares, often in public daylight. Yet normalization can make atrocity look ordinary to those who benefit from it. Defenders of slavery developed a language of justification that sounds chillingly familiar in many oppressive systems. They claimed enslaved people were cared for. They said discipline was necessary. They argued sudden freedom would create chaos. They insisted outsiders misunderstood plantation life. Some wrapped bondage in religion, saying hierarchy was divinely sanctioned. Others hid behind property law. If it was legal, they implied, how immoral could it be? This ability to translate violence into respectable language helped slavery survive 4 generations. In the North, opposition to slavery existed, but so did indifference, racism, and convenience. Many white Northerners disliked slaveholders' political power more than slavery itself. Some opposed expansion of slavery into new territories, while caring little for black equality. Others preferred not to think about the subject at all. It was easier to condemn Southern arrogance than to examine Northern profits linked to slave-grown goods. Distance performed moral work. If the lash fell hundreds of miles away, conscience could sleep. Popular culture also distorted reality. Plantation fiction and minstrel caricatures depicted enslaved people as loyal, childlike, or content. These lies soothed consumers who wanted entertainment without guilt. Even newspaper coverage often reduced enslaved people to statistics, fugitives, or political talking points. Rarely were they centered as full human beings with intellect, fear, humor, longing, and strategic resistance. Yet resistance was constant. Some slowed work, broke tools, preserved family bonds, learned secretly to read, practiced forbidden worship, escaped, revolted, negotiated, remembered African traditions, or simply maintained dignity under conditions designed to erase it. Slavery depended not on passive acceptance, but on daily coercion against daily resistance. This is crucial. The system was never stable because the people trapped inside it never truly accepted its legitimacy. By the time the Civil War began, the nation had spent decades arguing over tariffs, territories, and constitutional powers. But beneath those debates was a simpler truth: who had the right to own whom. Politicians often spoke in abstractions, because abstractions are safer than realities. States' rights sounds cleaner than auction blocks. Property rights sounds cleaner than a child sold away. Regional custom sounds cleaner than a back opened by a whip. That is why Gordon's image landed like a detonation. It bypassed argument. It bypassed euphemism. It showed what words had hidden. Many northern viewers, who had tolerated complexity, suddenly faced clarity. You could still defend slavery after seeing that photograph, but you had to defend scars. You had to defend torn flesh. You had to defend the visible consequences of invisible laws. Some did, many could not. And once public sentiment begins to shift from policy to morality, history accelerates. The image did not create abolitionism, nor did it end slavery alone, but it punctured the fog that had protected the institution. It made distant suffering intimate. It made comfort uncomfortable. Most of all, it revealed that the true strength of slavery had never been chains alone. It was the nation's willingness to look away. The photograph did not win the war by itself, but it became something nearly as dangerous to the defenders of slavery: undeniable evidence. In every age, power depends not only on force, but on controlling what people are allowed to see. For generations, slavery in America had been defended through speeches, sermons, newspaper columns, and polished manners. Plantation owners spoke of honor. Politicians spoke of constitutional balance. Editors spoke of economic necessity. But none of those words could survive the sight of Gordon's back. Once the image entered circulation, abolitionists recognized immediately that they possessed more than a photograph. They possessed a weapon. By 1863, the anti-slavery movement had already fought for decades. Black activists, escaped slaves, ministers, lecturers, women organizers, newspaper editors, and radical politicians had built a moral campaign long before the Civil War began. Figures like Frederick Douglass had described the lash in devastating detail. Harriet Beecher Stowe had stirred Northern readers through fiction. Formerly enslaved witnesses had risked their safety to testify publicly. Yet opponents often dismissed spoken testimony as exaggeration or propaganda. A camera changed the argument. The lens seemed impartial. It recorded what many Americans had refused to imagine. Copies of the image spread through carts de visite, newspapers, pamphlets, and lecture networks. In churches, ministers held it up before congregations. In meeting halls, speakers passed it hand to hand. In private homes, families stared in silence. Some viewers reportedly wept. Others felt rage. Some likely turned away, not because they doubted it, but because they believed it too easily. The photograph transformed audiences into witnesses. Abolitionist strategy had always understood emotion as political force. Facts matter, but facts alone rarely move nations. Statistics about millions enslaved could be skimmed and forgotten. Legal arguments could be postponed, but one wounded body could pierce indifference in seconds. Gordon's back condensed the entire institution into visible flesh. Every scar implied a hand that struck, a law that permitted it, neighbors who tolerated it, markets that financed it, and the republic that had compromised with it for generations. The image also challenged a common northern illusion that slavery was harsh in theory but moderate in practice. Defenders had long promoted paternal fantasies of kind masters and content workers. Gordon's scars tore through that mythology. No paternal system produces tissue like that. No benevolent order leaves the body mapped by cruelty. Even those who disliked abolitionists could not easily deny what was before them. This mattered profoundly in 1863 because the Union cause was evolving. At the war's beginning, many soldiers claimed they fought to preserve the nation, not necessarily to destroy slavery. President Lincoln himself moved cautiously, balancing military necessity, border state politics, and public opinion. But war changes language. As Union armies advanced, they encountered the reality of slavery directly: labor camps, runaways, chained bodies, families seeking refuge. The institution could no longer remain abstract. Gordon's image entered the changing climate like fuel on fire. It gave ordinary Northerners a picture to match what the war was revealing. Newspapers and activists used such images to argue that emancipation was not a distraction from victory, it was central to victory. How could the Union restore the old nation without confronting the violence that had shattered it? The photograph also strengthened support for black enlistment. If slavery was this brutal, then formerly enslaved men had every moral claim to fight against it. Their service became both military necessity and historical justice. Thousands would soon wear Union blue, battling a confederacy built explicitly to preserve slavery. In that sense, the image did not merely expose suffering, it helped legitimize resistance. Of course, backlash followed. Pro-slavery voices denounced abolitionist use of emotional imagery. Some minimized the wounds. Others insisted isolated abuse did not represent the whole system. This defense appears in every era of injustice. Admit a little, deny the structure. But Gordon's scars were too systematic to feel accidental. They looked like repetition because they were repetition. They looked institutional because they were institutional. What made the photograph so potent was not simply horror. It was clarity. It forced Americans to understand that slavery was not failing because a few cruel men misused it. Slavery was cruel because it functioned as designed. The whip was not corruption of the system. It was part of the system's grammar. And so a single image traveled farther than speeches, farther than battle lines, farther than excuses. It entered memory. It entered classrooms. It entered the conscience of a nation still deciding what kind of country it wanted to be. In the months ahead, as Lincoln's war became a war for freedom, Gordon's scarred back stood as silent testimony that compromise with slavery had already gone on too long. By 1863, the Civil War had already consumed more American lives than anyone at its beginning imagined. What many thought would be a short conflict had become an industrial slaughter. Fields from Virginia to Tennessee were soaked in blood. Towns became hospitals. Families opened letters with shaking hands, fearing black-bordered envelopes and the words every household dreaded. Yet amid all this death, the central political question of the war still remained unsettled for many white Americans. Was the Union fighting merely to restore itself, or to become something new? Gordon's photograph arrived at the exact moment that question could no longer be delayed. When Abraham Lincoln entered office in 1861, he did not begin as a revolutionary emancipator in the public sense later memory would create. He hated slavery, but he moved cautiously. His first priority was preserving the Union. Border slave states like Kentucky and Maryland still remained in the Union, and pushing too fast against slavery, driving them into the Confederacy. Northern Democrats warned that abolition would fracture support for the war. Many soldiers enlisted to save the flag, not to free enslaved people. Lincoln understood politics, and politics often moves slower than morality. But war has a way of exposing what peace can hide. As Union armies marched southward, they encountered enslaved people fleeing plantations and approaching federal lines in growing numbers. Men, women, and children forced the issue onto commanders who had hoped to avoid it. Could the Union Army return them to owners, feed them, employ them, protect them? Every camp became a constitutional crisis. Every refugee family made neutrality harder. Generals improvised. Congress debated confiscation laws. The battlefield was rewriting policy in real time. Then came January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. Contrary to myth, it did not instantly free every enslaved person in America. It declared freedom for enslaved people in areas still under Confederate control, where Lincoln lacked immediate enforcement power, while exempting certain Union-held areas. Yet symbolically and strategically, it changed everything. The war was no longer only about reunion. It was now openly tied to destroying slavery. European powers, considering recognition of the Confederacy, faced a new reality. Supporting the South increasingly meant supporting slavery itself. Black Americans heard something else entirely, the sound of a locked door beginning to crack open. Gordon's photograph entered this transformed landscape from a visual echo of emancipation. The proclamation was words on paper. The image was flesh-marked by the reason those words now existed. Together, they formed a devastating argument. If some still asked why slavery must end, the scars supplied an answer no speechwriter could improve. If some still asked why the war must continue despite its cost, the photograph suggested what peace had previously protected. The Union Army also needed manpower. Casualties were staggering. Enlistment slowed. Here again emancipation altered strategy. The federal government began recruiting black soldiers on a large scale. Nearly 200,000 black men would eventually serve in the Union Army and Navy. Many had once been enslaved. Some joined from refugee camps. Others escaped specifically to enlist. They fought not for abstract patriotism alone, but for family, dignity, wages, citizenship, and revenge against a system that had hunted them. In some accounts, Gordon himself joined Union forces after reaching safety. Whether every detail can be fully verified, the possibility alone captures the eerie transformation. A man once whipped under American law now potentially bearing arms for American freedom. That reversal terrified Confederates and unsettled many racists in the North. But it was happening. The old order was cracking under pressure of war. Lincoln, too, was changing. His language sharpened over time. He increasingly recognized that slavery was not a side issue in war's complications, it was the engine of secession itself. By the time he delivered the Gettysburg Address in late 1863, the conflict had become linked to a new birth of freedom. Those words were elegant. Gordon's back was blunt. Together, they described the same turning point, yet transformation never arrives cleanly. Racism remained widespread in the North. Black soldiers were often paid less, assigned harder labor, and massacred when captured. Draft riots in New York revealed violent hatred toward black people and federal authority alike. Many who accepted emancipation still rejected equality. America could decide slavery must die, while still resisting what freedom might require. That contradiction would haunt the nation long after the guns fell silent. Still, in 1863, something irreversible had happened. The war's meaning had shifted. No matter how politicians hedged, no matter how cautious the speeches, millions now understood that the conflict was tied to the fate of human bondage. Gordon's scars helped make that understanding visible. They stood as proof that neutrality had been its own form of choice, and once a nation sees the truth of what it has tolerated, it can never honestly claim ignorance again. When the guns finally fell silent in 1865, many Americans believed the hardest chapter was over. The Confederacy had collapsed. Slave markets were closed. Plantation masters, who once claimed permanent power, stood defeated. Abraham Lincoln was dead, assassinated just days after Robert E. Lee's surrender. But many hoped his victory would become the nation's rebirth. For 4 million formerly enslaved people, however, freedom was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a far more uncertain struggle. How do you build a life after generations of theft? Gordon's photograph did not retire with the war. It entered a new battlefield, the fight over what emancipation would actually mean. Freedom in legal language did not automatically create food, land, schools, wages, or safety. Across the South, formerly enslaved families began searching for loved ones sold away years earlier. Men walked roads asking for wives. Mothers placed newspaper notices for children last seen as toddlers. Brothers searched counties where records were missing or false. Some reunions happened by miracle. Many never did. Slavery had ended, but its wreckage filled every road. At the same time, black communities moved with astonishing speed to build institutions long denied to them. Churches multiplied. Mutual aid societies formed. Schools opened in cabins, churches, army barracks, and abandoned buildings. Literacy became an act of triumph. Elderly men and women who had been forbidden to read now traced letters beside children. Education was not merely practical, it was symbolic. To read was to reclaim the mind from a system that had tried to keep it captive. Politically, Reconstruction began one of the boldest democratic experiments in American history. The federal government, through constitutional amendments and military enforcement, attempted to redefine citizenship itself. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th promised birthright citizenship and equal protection. The 15th sought voting rights for black men. In theory, these measures remade the republic. In practice, every inch of progress met organized resistance. Here again, images like Gordon's mattered. Abolitionists and radical Republicans used reminders of slavery's brutality to argue that freedom without protection was fraud. If the nation had gone to war over such cruelty, how could it now abandon those once subjected to it? Newspapers, speeches, and campaigns invoked the reality of the lash to justify federal intervention in the South. Gordon's scarred back remained evidence that old masters could not simply be trusted to govern new citizens fairly, and they were not. Former Confederates moved quickly to regain control through Black Codes laws, designed to force black labor, restrict movement, punish unemployment, and recreate dependency under another name. Vagrancy statutes criminalized poverty. Apprenticeship laws bound black children to white employers. Violence surged where law hesitated. White supremacist groups, most notoriously the Ku Klux Klan, used murder, terror, arson, and intimidation to reverse emancipation through fear. Night Riders did what armies no longer could. They sought to restore hierarchy without officially restoring slavery. Yet Reconstruction was not only reaction, it was achievement. Black men voted in large numbers, held office at local, state, and federal levels, and helped rewrite Southern constitutions. Public school systems expanded. Infrastructure projects advanced. Tax structures shifted. For a brief moment, interracial democracy imperfect, embattled, but real took root in places where bondage had ruled. This period is often minimized in popular memory, but it represented a radical possibility that the United States might emerge from slavery into multiracial citizenship. Gordon's image, and others like it, haunted the debate because they made compromise morally expensive. To surrender black rights after seeing what slavery had done required a special kind of forgetting, and forgetting soon became politically useful. Northern fatigue grew. Economic crises distracted voters. Corruption scandals weakened reformers. Many white Northerners who had supported ending slavery proved less committed to sustaining equality. They wanted sectional peace more than racial justice. That desire would become the opening through which reaction returned. By the 1870s, federal resolve weakened. Troops withdrew from many areas. White supremacist paramilitaries suppressed black voting through massacre and terror. Court decisions narrowed constitutional protections. The promises of Reconstruction began to erode before they had fully matured. Freedom remained real, but increasingly unguarded. For formerly enslaved families, this betrayal was not theoretical. It meant debt peonage, segregated schools, stolen wages, lynching threats, and the constant message that emancipation had boundaries. America had destroyed slavery's legal shell while allowing much of its social logic to survive. That is why the post-war years matter so deeply. They reveal that ending oppression and replacing oppression are different tasks. The nation succeeded at the first only partially and stumbled badly at the second. Gordon's scars belonged to the age of slavery, but the struggle over their meaning belonged to Reconstruction. Were they proof of a past decisively defeated or warning of a future that could mutate and return? America was about to answer. History is rarely erased in one dramatic moment. More often, it is softened, sanded down, rearranged until the sharp edges no longer cut. After Reconstruction began to collapse in the late 19th century, the United States entered one of its most consequential acts of self-deception. It started rewriting the meaning of slavery and the Civil War in ways that comforted the powerful. Gordon's scars still existed in archives and memory, but the nation increasingly preferred stories that demanded less honesty. This was the age when the South lost the war, but won much of the narrative. Former Confederates and their sympathizers developed what became known as the lost cause mythology. According to this version of events, the Confederacy had fought not primarily for slavery, but for honor, local liberty, states' rights, and noble resistance against overwhelming force. Southern generals became tragic heroes. Plantation society became romanticized. Enslaved people were depicted as loyal dependents or content laborers. Violence, if acknowledged at all, was treated as occasional abuse rather than structural reality. It was a masterful inversion. A rebellion launched to preserve human bondage was repackaged as a defense of principle. This mythology did not remain confined to ex-Confederate circles. It spread through textbooks, veterans' organizations, newspapers, women's memorial associations, political speeches, and eventually Hollywood. Monuments rose across courthouse lawns and city squares not immediately after the war, but often decades later, during the height of segregation. Their purpose was not only to honor the dead, it was to instruct the living. Bronze soldiers standing over black citizens entering segregated courthouses sent a clear message about who still held power. Memory became architecture. Schoolchildren across America were taught versions of the Civil War that centered generals, battle tactics, and sectional misunderstanding, while minimizing slavery's central role. Lessons praised reconciliation between white North and white South, often at the expense of black freedom. This bargain was emotionally convenient. White Americans could celebrate national reunion without confronting the racial hierarchy that reunion preserved. The suffering of formerly enslaved people became secondary to the healing of former enemies. Gordon's back did not fit such ceremonies. Popular culture deepened the distortion. Novels and films portrayed plantations as elegant worlds of gracious manners and faithful servants. Perhaps the most influential was Gone with the Wind, which turned the antebellum South into a grand tragedy of lost gentility. Viewers were invited to mourn ruined mansions more than ruined families sold apart. The camera lingered on chandeliers, while history's real scars remained off-screen. Meanwhile, racist caricatures in minstrel traditions and entertainment continued to portray black people as comic, childlike, or dangerous anything but full citizens whose bondage had built wealth for others. Law reinforced myth. The rise of Jim Crow segregation from the late 19th century into the 20th formalized a new racial order. Separate schools, transportation, housing, voting barriers, and terror maintained white dominance after slavery's abolition. Lynchings served as public warnings. Economic exploitation continued through sharecropping, convict leasing, and discriminatory labor systems. Yet because slavery was legally gone, many Americans congratulated themselves on progress while tolerating its descendants. That is how historical amnesia works, by treating a transformed injustice as a solved injustice. Gordon's image survived in some textbooks, museums, and scholarly works because it was too powerful to disappear entirely. But even where shown, it was often isolated from continuity. Students might learn slavery was brutal, then be rushed past Reconstruction, segregation, redlining, and mass disenfranchisement, as if the story ended neatly in 1865. The photograph became evidence of a closed chapter, rather than an opening chapter to later struggles. This selective framing allowed many citizens to say, "That was then," without asking how then became now. Why would a nation choose softer myths over harder truths? Because myths are useful. They preserve pride, ease guilt, stabilize political coalitions, and protect inherited status. If slavery was merely a regrettable imperfection in an otherwise noble past, then no deep reckoning is required. If the Civil War was just a family quarrel between honorable sides, then no side need answer for what it fought to preserve. If racial inequality today has no historical roots, then contemporary disparities can be blamed on individuals instead of systems. The narrative serves power because it narrows responsibility, yet truth has a stubborn habit of returning. Black historians, journalists, teachers, families, church communities, and activists preserved counter-memories through oral history. scholarship, protest, and art. They kept naming what official memory tried to blur. They kept showing photographs like Gordon's. They kept insisting that scars were not footnotes. By the 20th century, civil rights activists would again expose America's contradictions, using images, fire hoses, police dogs, bombed churches, beaten marchers, much as abolitionists once used Gordon's back. The pattern was familiar. When words failed, pictures forced confrontation. Still, the struggle over memory never ended. It only changed form, because once a country learns it can edit the past for comfort, it often returns to the habit whenever the truth feels inconvenient. And in the 21st century, America would do it again, more than a century and a half after the camera captured Gordon's back. The old battle returned in a modern building with climate control, polished signage, and federal employees carrying clipboards instead of rifles. In September 2025, reports emerged that the National Park Service employees told the Washington Post that the photograph known as Scourge Back had been flagged for removal at their park, along with a wider set of exhibits involving slavery. The image that once shocked Civil War America was now, according to those accounts, considered expendable inside the government charged with preserving national memory. The immediate backdrop was President Donald Trump's executive order targeting what was broadly labeled diversity, equity, and inclusion. In public rhetoric, the order was framed as a campaign against ideological excess, bureaucratic activism, and politicized institutions. But critics argued that in practice, such directives often reached far beyond management programs or hiring language. They touched museum text, historical interpretation, educational materials, and exhibits dealing with race, gender, and structural injustice. Once broad political slogans descend into agencies, frontline staff are left to guess what may become controversial. In that atmosphere, caution can become censorship before anyone explicitly commands it. This is how memory is often narrowed in bureaucratic democracies, not always through bonfires, but through uncertainty. The reported removal or review of slavery-related material was significant because the National Park Service occupies a special role in American civic life. Its sites are not merely tourist destinations. They are classrooms of stone, battlefield grass, preserved houses, visitor centers, trails, monuments, and archives where millions encounter national history in physical space. For many visitors, what appears on those walls may shape their understanding more than any textbook ever did. A child may forget dates learned in school, but remember seeing shackles behind glass, standing in a preserved slave cabin, or reading a quote from someone once denied freedom. To alter those spaces is to alter a public curriculum. Why would a photograph like Gordon's become controversial in such a climate? Because it resists sanitized patriotism. It does not flatter the nation. It cannot be easily folded into triumphant narratives about progress without first forcing viewers to confront cruelty. It raises uncomfortable questions. Who profited? Who enforced it? Who looked away? What survives of that system now? For political movements built on celebrating national greatness without complication, such images are troublesome. They insist greatness and brutality coexisted. Supporters of anti-day efforts often argued something different. They said institutions had become overly focused on race, grievance, and division. They claimed Americans needed unifying stories rather than endless emphasis on historical sins. Some believed historical sites should inspire civic pride, not guilt. Others feared present-day politics were being retroactively projected onto the past. These arguments resonated with many citizens tired of polarization, but they contained a deeper question rarely stated plainly: unity around which version of memory? Because a unity built on omission asks some people to forget more than others. Critics of the reported removals saw a familiar pattern. When nations feel politically anxious, they often simplify their histories. Complexity becomes suspect. Painful chapters are recast as secondary. Structural crimes become isolated mistakes. The language changes balance. Neutrality patriotism, anti-bias, but the effect can be similar, less room for evidence that unsettles inherited narratives. Gordon's back, once circulated to awaken conscience, now risks being hidden because conscience remains inconvenient. There was also irony impossible to miss. The same image used by abolitionists to expose what many 19th century Americans preferred not to see was now reportedly threatened in the 21st century by people claiming to oppose ideological distortion. Yet suppressing evidence is itself a form of distortion. If a visitor learns about troop movements and presidential speeches, but not the bodies scarred by the institution at the center of the conflict, what kind of neutrality is that? Memory struggles are rarely about the past alone. They are battles over legitimacy in the present. Debates over slavery exhibits connect to arguments about voting rights, policing, education, immigration, demographic change, and who gets to define real America. To some, emphasizing slavery reveals unresolved injustice. To others, it feels like accusation directed at people who did not commit those crimes. Political entrepreneurs know how to weaponize both reactions. Thus, a 19th century photograph becomes 21st century ammunition. Yet controversy can also revive what it seeks to suppress. Reports of flagged exhibits drew renewed attention to Gordon's image from people who had never seen it. Journalists covered it. Teachers discussed it. Social media circulated it anew. Once again, an attempt to manage memory risks spreading memory further. History has its own sense of irony. The scars that some wanted less visible became newly visible because they were threatened. This episode reminded the country of an old truth. Archives do not defend themselves. Museums do not preserve meaning automatically. Facts require caretakers, and public memory requires citizens willing to ask, what is being removed? What is being emphasized? And why? Because when a nation begins deciding which evidence is too uncomfortable to display, it is no longer only interpreting history, it is negotiating with truth. Removing a photograph from a wall can seem minor. No chains are restored. No law is automatically rewritten. No one is physically harmed in that instant. And yet history shows that what societies choose not to display often matters almost as much as what they choose to celebrate. Public memory is not decoration. It is infrastructure. It shapes what citizens believe happened, what was normal, who suffered, who benefited, and what obligations remain unfinished. That is why the fight over Gordon's image was never just about one photograph. It was about whether evidence of cruelty remains visible in the civic bloodstream. Nations construct identity through stories repeated across generations. School lessons, monuments, holidays, museums, films, battlefield tour, presidential speeches all teach people how to feel about their country. Pride, grief, shame, admiration, suspicion. These emotions are distributed through narrative. If a country tells only stories of triumph, citizens may inherit confidence without humility. If it tells only stories of failure, they may inherit cynicism without belonging. But all memory requires both achievement and atrocity held together. But that balance is difficult, because honest history can wound cherished myths. Images like Gordon's are powerful because they interrupt abstraction. Many people can discuss slavery in the language of centuries, economics, or constitutional compromise without feeling much. Then they see a human back transformed into scar tissue, and the mind is forced into specifics. Someone ordered that. Someone administered it. Someone heard it. Someone profited from it. Someone justified it. Suddenly history is no longer distant weather. It is human decision. That is exactly why uncomfortable images are often the first targets in memory disputes. They reduce room for denial. They make euphemism harder. Consider how many turning points in modern history depended on images. Photographs from Nazi concentration camps confronted post-war denial. Televised scenes of police attacking civil rights marchers in Selma altered public opinion. Pictures from Vietnam shifted attitudes toward war. The Abu Ghraib prison images exposed abuses that official language concealed. In each case, visuals punctured sanitized narratives. They did not create morality, but they accelerated recognition. Gordon's photograph belongs to that lineage. It is evidence with emotional force. Critics sometimes respond that constantly displaying painful history traps societies in guilt. There is a serious concern hidden inside that claim. Memory can be used performatively, commercially, or selectively. Institutions may showcase past injustice while ignoring present inequality. People may consume tragedy as spectacle rather than understanding. Those are real dangers. But the solution to shallow remembrance is deeper remembrance, not erasure. Removing evidence because it can be mishandled is like closing courts because trials can be unfair. Better interpretation is needed, not silence. There is also a distinction between guilt and responsibility. Citizens today did not personally wield 19th century whips, but they do inherit institutions, wealth patterns, legal precedents, landscapes, and narratives shaped by that era. Responsibility means understanding inheritance honestly enough to govern it wisely. A person need not feel personal guilt over slavery to recognize that slavery's consequences did not vanish in 1865. Honest memory asks for literacy, not self-hatred. Forgetting, by contrast, has predictable costs. When exploitation is remembered only vaguely, modern inequalities appear natural or accidental. When voter suppression's history is minimized, contemporary restrictions seem isolated. When racial violence is treated as fringe rather than systemic, trust in institutions erodes. Whenever patterns recur, when forced labor's profits are forgotten, wealth disparities are discussed as if created in a vacuum. Historical amnesia does not create neutrality. It creates confusion advantageous to whoever already holds power. Museums and public sites matter precisely because they slow this drift into confusion. They provide curated encounters with evidence outside algorithmic bubbles and partisan feeds. A visitor may enter expecting comfort and leave with complexity. That is democratic value. Shared spaces where facts are publicly presented, debated, and preserved help societies argue on common ground. If those spaces become timid, memory fragments into tribes. Each group carries its own past, suspicious of all others. Gordon's image also matters because it restores individuality against the scale of statistics. 4 million enslaved is true, but difficult to emotionally process. One scarred back is also true and impossible to ignore. Human beings often understand systems through persons. That is why testimony remains central in law, journalism, and moral life. We need faces, names, bodies, voices. Oppression counts on turning people into numbers. Memory reverses that process. So when an image disappears from public view, the loss is not merely aesthetic. A witness has been removed from the room. The question then becomes, who benefits when the witness is absent? Usually not the dead. Usually not the descendants of those harmed. Usually not citizens seeking maturity. More often, absence benefits narratives that prefer admiration without scrutiny, and a republic that seeks admiration more than truth is preparing itself to repeat what it refuses to remember. The scars never disappeared, they only changed where Americans were willing to look. In 1863, Gordon's back confronted a nation at war with itself. In 2025, the controversy over that same image confronted a nation still arguing over memory, race, patriotism, and power. More than 160 years separate those moments, yet the central struggle remains hauntingly familiar. Will the United States face what built it, or keep editing the evidence until the story feels easier to love? The temptation to sanitize history is ancient and bipartisan. Every country prefers legends to ledgers. Legends inspire. Ledgers itemize costs. Legends celebrate founders. Ledgers ask who was excluded. Legends raise flags. Ledgers examine whose hands stitched them unpaid. America is not unique in this instinct, but it is unusually shaped by it, because the nation was born proclaiming liberty while permitting slavery on a vast scale. That contradiction became foundational. It did not vanish with emancipation. It echoed through Reconstruction, segregation, redlining, policing, schooling, labor markets, and political rhetoric. Gordon's photograph endures because it captures contradiction in one frame. A republic of ideals etched onto the body of a man denied them. Some viewers ask why the country must keep returning to such images. Why reopen old wounds? Why dwell on cruelty when progress has also occurred? The answer is that unexamined wounds do not heal cleanly. They scar beneath the surface, distorting movement long after pain is denied. Nations are no different. Ignored injustices become mistrust. Silenced histories become conspiracy. Sanitized education becomes fragility, where citizens feel personally attacked whenever facts complicate pride. Honest memory, by contrast, can produce resilience. A country secure enough to face its failures is stronger than one dependent on flattering myths. There is another reason the photograph still matters. It restores agency to the people history often reduces to victims. Gordon was brutalized, yes, but he also escaped. He survived patrols, swamps, dogs, and a legal order designed to own him. He reached Union lines. He stood before the camera. In some accounts, he later served in uniform. That arc matters. The image is not only about suffering, it is about endurance, resistance, and the refusal of a human being to remain property. Too often American memory commemorates the crimes of the powerful more vividly than the courage of those who resisted them. Gordon's life pushes against that imbalance. The modern debate over exhibits and removals also reveals something larger about democracy. Free societies do not merely vote over taxes and leaders. They vote, formally and informally, over memory. What appears in museums, whose names are on buildings. What children read in school. Which anniversaries are celebrated. What monuments stay or fall. These are arguments about identity disguised as administrative decisions. Whoever shapes memory influences the moral horizon of the future. If young citizens inherit only heroic narratives, they may struggle to recognize abuse when wrapped in patriotic language. If they inherit only condemnation, they may struggle to love the common project enough to improve it. The challenge is not choosing between pride and shame. It is learning to hold both truth and belonging at once. Gordon's scars ask whether Americans are willing to attempt that maturity. There is a cruel irony in trying to hide such an image. The scars were originally inflicted to enforce silence. Whipping was meant to terrorize, to warn others, to crush will. But the marks became testimony. What was intended as domination became evidence against the dominators. Then, generations later, attempts to remove that evidence risk repeating the logic of the lash in softer form. Make the consequences less visible. Make the system easier to defend. Make memory obedient. Yet memory is stubborn. The image survives in archives, books, classrooms, documentaries, conversations, and now digital networks no single curator controls. Once truth enters circulation deeply enough, suppression often publicizes it anew. That may be the final lesson of Gordon's back. Power can wound bodies. It can rewrite curricula. It can rename programs, move displays, and reshape ceremonies. But it cannot fully command what evidence means once people have seen it. The scars remain interpretable by anyone willing to look honestly. They ask no party loyalty. They ask no ideology. They ask only recognition. So the question facing America is not whether the past was brutal. The scars settled that long ago. The question is whether a modern nation built partly from that past can bear to remember it without flinching. Because history that is hidden does not become harmless. It becomes unfinished. And unfinished history has a habit of returning when least expected. Gordon's back warned one century. It may still be warning another.